Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our study group discussing History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps by Peter Adamson. And today with me I have Rogerio Marquez and Graham Pong. Welcome, guys.
Nice to be here.
Great to have another swing at, this time Socrates.
Yeah, today we'll be discussing Socrates and in particular how he was portrayed by three different philosophers, Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato.
Yeah, here they are.
Hey.
The groundbreaking sage of Athens that unfortunately left us no direct written legacy, and the three individuals who who wrote him as a character. The first one a very comedic, satirical take, and the other two a bit more serious, but still with each one with their quirks.
Yeah, so we have three quite different versions of Socrates in his three different tellings of him. And I guess the least flattering would be from the one by Aristophanes, who was a satirist and a comic who sort of portrayed people in unflattering lights, like anyone and everyone. Xenophon came to Socrates' defense after his trial, being sentenced to drinking hemlock, and Plato was a massive fan of Socrates and idealized him to a great extent.
I really like how this slide ended up, because Socrates is kind of in late 60s as of age, more or less. Aristophanes a bit younger looking, and the two youngsters are more or less similar in terms of parent age, which coincides more or less with their dates of birth. So we kind of expect Socrates to be quite older than Plato. And so we could also give a bit of historical context here. But first, I would like to ask if Graham has initial comments.
Well, I was going to sit there and say Plato was the original fanboy for Socrates. That's for sure. Sorry. No, Socrates, he was a very, he was basically one of those crux points where everything converged on him and then exploded after him. He kind of took the idea of knowledge, and he sort of introduced started wrestling with what is knowledge, can we actually have any knowledge, and brought that one before the whole idea of philosophy, which is something that philosophy hadn't wrestled with before Socrates. And once he introduced that concept, pretty much everybody had to answer that one before they went further. So Socrates became almost the new gatekeeper, sort of he was sort of Lord of the Rings, like he was the one philosopher in ignorance bound them, and then they had to find their way out of ignorance again once he had revealed they actually were in ignorance. So that's what makes, in my opinion at least, that's what makes Socrates such a huge and important philosopher. Was he was the one? There was before and there was after Socrates. That's why they call him pre-Socratics. Tagging on that.
Yeah, we're going to figure out why he is basically used as the suffix for the word pre-Socratic. There were before him many thinkers of note, as we've talked about, especially from the Ionian and Magna Grecian traditions. But they were kind of scattered and in the fringes of the Greek world, except for before Socrates, Anaxagoras, and the sophists flocking to Athens, because Athens was quite a wealthy place to serve as a good market for the sophists. And after Socrates, Western philosophy will be forever changed. The Hellenistic tradition and the schools that sprang forth after Socrates, the academy founded by Plato, later on the Peripatetics or Lyceum founded by Aristotle, and then we have the Cynics, which draw from Socrates very heavily and go really hardcore with the virtue thing. Then we have the Stoics, which mix a few ideas from other schools. Also the skeptics and the Epicureans. And these guys are basically the after Socrates, that we will also get to them after we spend a bit with Socrates and Plato's writings. To show a bit of the context. So, as usual, Greek world, but we will be focusing on mainland Greece, especially Athens, and to give a really Cliff Notes version of how is Athens during the time of Socrates. So Socrates actually fought in the Peloponnesian War. He was a war veteran. He survived a defeat in a battle. I think it was called Battle of Delium. Correct me if I'm wrong. He saw the city of Athens and the empire it had built kind of fall pretty hard. There was, after Athens capitulated, after the Sicilian expedition, a period in which 30 oligarchs took control of Athens, possibly kind of puppets from the Spartans. And they even asked Socrates at one time to arrest an innocent guy, and Socrates even refused to do such a thing. And so, yeah, I think this gives a bit of the context. If you guys want to add anything, please do so. Otherwise, we'll move on to the first guy who wrote about Socrates.
Yeah, I think besides the sort of political context, it is also helpful to remember there are some philosophers or sophists before Socrates that seems to have influenced Socrates. So, for example, I think Prodicus was very adamant that it's very important to clearly define terms as a way to avoid running into error with the kinds of misleading arguments that a lot of people were making all over the place, rhetoricians were making. And Socrates seems to have taken a similar tact in placing definitions at the core of his inquiry. And Socrates also had this this belief that seems to have sprung from the Ionians, but shared by the Eleatics, that, or maybe more the Eleatics than Ionians, that arguments are much more important than empirical evidence. So that in order to arrive at knowledge, the key thing is to make arguments. And even if the arguments lead to conclusions that seem to run counter to common experience, it's the common experience that should be discarded, and the argument should be kept. So I'm thinking, especially with the Eleatics, it would argue things like motion is impossible, or reality is one eternal, unchanging thing. That seems to very clearly run against common experience, as an example of the kinds of things that came before Socrates. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but Socrates had some highly counterintuitive doctrines about the workings of human minds that seem to run counter to experience, that he then backed up with arguments like the Eleatics would back up their counterintuitive claims with arguments.
Any remarks to complement, Graham?
No, I was going to say Nodalian hit it pretty good. Where Socrates, again, Socrates was just leading up to it. He was basically, the everyman of Greece becoming a philosopher, the veteran of the wars, the citizen of Athens, and he was sort of kind of an exemplar of what was going on in there. And that's part of what makes Socrates so great. Now, interested in diving into Aristophanes. So.
Yeah, let's go. I was honestly surprised by what Aristophanes was up to. So, to give a summary, his name is actually quite an interesting name, and I'm not sure if it is an artistic name. It means the one who appears best. Aris, which means excellence, and Ophanes or whatnot, is a composite word about that. And so he started as a youth writing plays. He wrote his first play at 17 years old. He couldn't even compete with it because supposedly he had to be 18 for the play to be produced. He was also quite an anti-war activist. At least two of the plays I've checked from him, the Acarnians and the Knights, his two earliest plays that were quite in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, and so kind of in the context of this trauma from war, and he quite severely criticizes warmongers in general. He also commented a lot about justice in his plays. He even satirized this guy who we talked about in the last session, named Cleon, who wanted to massacre the whole population, male population of Lesbos, and enslave women and children. Aristophanes, it shows he really reviled Cleon with a passion. And also, although Socrates and the Sophists would clash, Aristophanes just pegged them all in the same bag, same category. He wrote almost 40 plays, but only 11 survived to our day. Before we move on, do you guys want to comment on what this slide has?
Yeah, just maybe note that his plays were of a, I think I said this already, of a satirical, comedic kind. So he would harshly criticize people in the form of satire and mock them and caricature them, portray them as unflattering in unflattering lights. So that's important to keep in mind with all of the people that feature in his plays. Really, like I think last time we talked about Aspasia, and in the hands of Aristophanes, she's a whore.
Yeah.
Other people had a bit of respect for her.
Not just a whore. He even classifies her as the main whore, the kind of boss whore of the other sub whores.
Yes, so like the runner of a brothel or something like that.
Yeah, almost like that. Yeah. He even paints a scenario in which he kind of argues that the Peloponnesian War happened because Athenians kidnapped some Megarian whores, and then vice versa, and then the war started. And so he kind of paints the war as something really petty and stupid. He drives the nail pretty hard on ridiculizing, portraying the war as something of immense ridicule, which at the time it makes kind of sense.
No, absolutely. It sounds, from what you're saying, is that the Peloponnesian War started because of a bunch of whore robbing. So, no, I was going to say on Aristophanes, for me, he's probably the easiest read of the ancient Greek playwrights, because his stuff still comes across pretty fresh and entertaining to modernize, where some of the others, especially the dramatists, can tend to just get ponderous sometimes from a modern sensibility, because we're used to a lot more flash and a lot more entertaining, and that just tends to get depressing and go down from there. So tagging on that.
Yeah, Aristophanes really seems like a bit similar to Aesop. He wrote for the common citizen, even maybe goat herders, even more modest people, for everyone to understand his points. And so he really popularized really well his comedy, I think. In contrast to others like Sophocles. Okay, so just to give a couple of examples in his war critique, he wrote the Acarnians and the Knights. The Acarnians, because it was a deme of Athens. I think it's like a neighborhood of Athens that was notorious for having a lot of guys that like war and were hoplites. It's furnished a huge contingent of hoplites for the Peloponnesian War. And the Knights, a satire on the political and social life in 5th century Athens, especially targeted against Cleon. And to the dismay of Cleon, it even won the first prize in the Lenaea festival, which was held during the winter when only Athenian citizens were at Athens. And so only the Athenian citizens were the main audience, while the Acarnians It satirized a lot of the warmongers of Athens and was held at summer, and so even the foreigners were at Athens, and they kind of were very embarrassed. Cleon was very embarrassed and criticized Aristophanes for portraying him and the other very prominent citizens of Athens in such a way. So as for the people that Aristophanes portrayed, he even personified the demos, which is the populace of Athens, personified them as what I interpreted as a wise elderly figure, but kind of down to earth, that has no cloak because the government forgot to give him one. So he kind of seems like a left-leaning kind of guy. Then Cleon, he would say things of Cleon like he spits at the sound of his name and stole food from the Prytanean. So kind of like a guy living from the common good. And Pericles, even though Pericles is, to my mind, quite an inspiring reader, he didn't spare Pericles either. Our own Olympian marvel. He got so angry that he began shooting lightning out of his mouth and making thunder and stirring the whole of Greece with laws which sounded like post-orgy songs. So the way that this paragraph starts very serious and intense and goes to to sex gags. And then Socrates, by my words, the big kahuna of the sophists in Aristophanes' interpretation. And so he would say things in the beginning of his Acarnians. Well, here I am, a pauper and a writer. So probably he wasn't very wealthy, even though his plays might be popular. Of comedies, no less. And I am about to speak to you, my dear audience, of matters that are important to our city. You all think this is a dreadful thing to do. I know. Well, don't. Comedians know justice, and I'm a comedian, so I'll speak about justice, no matter how hard it sounds to your ears. And then he would have in his Acarnians, some men, or rather some vile and hateful morons, losers, dishonorable scum, human forgeries, or wicked little men of a counterfeit kind, have begun making accusations about some products from Megara, which was allied to the Spartans, calling them enemy goods. First, it was those cute little Megarian cloaks, then the cucumbers, and then the rabbits, and then the little piggies, and then the garlic, and then the rock salt. No sooner would they see anyone selling anything from Megara, and straight away they'd shout, enemy goods, and they'd confiscate the damn thing, and on that very day you'd see them in the market selling enemy goods themselves and pocketing the money. So, yeah, this is Aristophanes for you. Any reaction, any words before we move on to my attempt at combining the Ionian guys and what Aristophanes interpreted? Go ahead.
No, that's new to me. It's quite entertaining. Yeah, I like it.
It's things that we recognize still today.
I was going to say, it sounds like he has a realistic picture of government there. Now, one thing I noticed is he may be the first writer that really, that wrote himself into his plays, in a very self-referential breaking the fourth wall sort of model there, where he's actually talking to his audience from within his play. The other one that strikes me is he seems very much a precursor to the Cynics later, because the Cynics really employed a lot of humor in their philosophy as well. So, tagging on that.
Yeah, I can see that. and then a pattern that I found interesting, from inspired by our previous session. So Xenophanes said, probably jokingly, that during the early 5th century that everything is made of clouds, and then Aristophanes ran with that later on. Clouds, the philosophers are obsessed with clouds. Socrates is a philosopher, so he has his head in the clouds, and that's where we go to his clouds. And the clouds are based in this synopsis. So an elderly man named Strepsiades, who was originally a rural guy, he married a young doll from Athens and moved into Athens at her bidding, and sold his farm. So he was a fish out of water in the bustling city. And so he had with his wife a boy who grows up absorbing all the urban vices possible, especially influenced by his mother, who already was kind of like a true city girl. And his son, Pheidippides, an irredeemable playboy. Strepsiades urged him to go learn with Socrates so he can defend himself through rhetoric against creditors, because this young boy amassed, due to his frivolous lifestyle, quite a few debts. Still, the youth refuses. So after much pining, the old man goes to study himself with Socrates. But old donkeys don't learn new tricks. And so we have this little bit of dialogue. And my proposal would be one of us to play Strepsiades and another to play Socrates.
I nominate Grampong to play Socrates.
Okay, Grampong plays Socrates. Okay, I can play Strepsiades. You cool with this, Graham?
Oh, I'm cool with it, absolutely.
Okay, awesome. So this slide and the next slide are this dialogue. So, Socrates, my little Socrates.
Oh, ephemeral one, what do you want with me?
First, what are you doing up there? Tell me, I beseech you.
I traverse the air and contemplate the sun.
Thus, 'tis not on the solid ground, but from the height of this basket, that you slight the gods, if indeed.
I have to suspend my brain and mingle the subtle essence of my mind with this air, which is of the like nature, in order to clearly penetrate the things of heaven. I should have discovered nothing had I remained on the ground to consider from below the things that are above. For the earth by its force attracts the sap of the mind to itself. 'Tis just the same with me. 'Tis just the same with the watercress. By which gods will you swear? To begin with, the gods are not a coin current with us.
But what do you swear by then? By the iron money of Byzantium?
Do you really wish to know the truth of celestial matters?
Why, truly, if 'tis possible.
Come, O clouds, whom I adore, come and show yourself to this man. Whether you be resting on the sacred summits of Olympus, crowned with hoarfrost, or tarrying in the gardens of Ocean with your father, forming sacred choruses with the nymphs, whether you be gathering the waves of the Nile in golden vases, or dwelling in the Maeotic marsh, or on the snowy rocks of Mimas. Hearken to my prayer and accept my offering. May these sacrifices be pleasing to you.
So at this point, I think it's quite clear what Peter Adamson was talking about when Aristophanes portrayed Socrates as a guy that might be messing around with religion. He, of course, probably made the entire thing up, and Socrates was not culpable fiddling around with what constitutes gods or not. But this kind of started probably a public conversation, and maybe started tarnishing Socrates' reputation in this sense, which resulted, I think, 2 decades later, or a quarter century later, in Socrates being charged and then sentenced to death by hemlock. And then to finish this thing, then after failing miserably to learn new tricks due to his aged mind, the master convinces Strepsiades to give up. In utter despair, the father finally convinces the youth to go study, but not without tormenting the old man. After all, the son, this Philippides, I haven't included an excerpt on him, but it is very likely that Philippides is kind of a symbolic of youth, of the Athenian youth. And through the interrelationship between character Socrates and Philippides, it also becomes clear that Socrates, instead of improving Philippides, is kind of taking him in a bad direction. Especially if we look at this in the context of the angle of Aristophanes. He was kind of showing Strepsiades as representing the older, timeless morality, tradition, gods, festivals, rituals, while the young guy was much more focused in intellectualism, materialism, especially after being influenced by Socrates. The country life versus city life, the lower class and honest labor class versus the upper class aristocracy and political skills or rhetoric in which they engaged in. Also the outdoor life associated with good health, physical strength, traits associated with Hercules, obviously, while indoor life associated with pale people that don't get no sun, and engage in this that they call thinkery, and possibly even mischief related to thinking. And probably people that didn't engage a lot of thinking were suspicious of the intellectuals. Also the contrast between hard physical work, physical exercise, between the idleness and up in the air nebulosities and mental exercises. The peasant rascality and vulgarism contrasted with sophistic intricacy and deception. And then the cloud chorus, which to Strepsiades would mean that they will be just related to nature, but Socrates makes a point that they are clearly deities of all things. And so, yeah, this is the clouds in a nutshell, my attempt at kind of summarizing this thing.
No, I think you did a great job. You showed where really this reflects even to this day. Aristophanes, what he wrote there for the everyman, it's the every time as well. Still true today. And the one thing that definitely stands out is how much he gave us that idiom of, somebody with their head in the clouds. We have Aristophanes to thank for that one. And, Socrates definitely embodied that adage. Taggins.
Well, so a couple of things. Peterson notes that it's in this play that Socrates is first portrayed as impious against the old gods and having a kind of new heretical religion, and also first portrayed as someone who corrupts youth. And those are the two charges for which he was trialed and condemned to drinking hemlock. So even if it may have been just a joke or not very carefully considered as an individual charge against Socrates, and more generally just a charge against sophists for who Socrates here was just a face, maybe Aristophanes can be some of the plausibility of those charges for the Athenians who voted about Socrates is attributable to Aristophanes portraying Socrates in this way.
Yep. Also, here are the twofold accusation against Socrates that resulted from whatever influence on Socrates' public image was born from display, the clouds, and also probably the discomfort and annoyance that Socrates caused to the elite citizenry of Athens, both directly when he confronts them and indirectly through his disciples, who Peter Adamson mentioned. That one of the things that would attract them to Socrates would be that Socrates knows how to catch these guys off guard in terms of argumentation goes, and they would really these young guys would really love to poke holes into the ideas and thinking of older guys, and so. Even though he Socrates might have been instructing the youth to think for themselves and also to argue effectively and to defend themselves in argument, probably this had nefarious consequences for Socrates' public image.
No, absolutely. I was going to say that's sort of the old adage, with the father telling his son, think for yourself, with the underlying message, as long as you come to the same conclusions I did. And it makes me wonder if, I don't know for certain, was the clouds before or after Socrates' trial?
Way before.
Way before? Okay.
Yeah, way before. So...
So this you can easily see where this almost led into it, sort of thing.
Oh, more or less a quarter century. So the first version of the clouds came out in 423 BC, according to my slide. There were two versions. There was a later version that I think we have in full, but the version that matters to start tarnishing Socrates' image was more or less a quarter century, which checks out with what Peter Adamson also said. So more or less 423 BC, while Socrates died in 399 BC.
Very good. Thanks.
And this is all that I have for Aristophanes. We also have the other two guys, the younger and more agreeable to Socrates guys.
Yes, I maybe have a couple of last comments. So the distinguishing feature of Aristophanes is he's presenting Socrates as just one of the sophists, whereas especially in Plato, Socrates is considered to be a very different kind of teacher than most of the sophists were. And in some ways they're similar. They're similar in being kind of these thinkery kind of people, like making arguments all day and talking about and debating about stuff. But one thing that set Socrates apart from most of the sophists is he did not charge a fee for participating in these things. So he lived quite poorly and he was poorly dressed, barefoot in rags kind of guy. And so like some of the problems with a conflict of interest that comes from charging rich clients money to teach them how to defend themselves using oratory and rhetoric go away if you're not doing that. So even if he's engaging in similar kinds of debates, he doesn't have that conflict of interest, which maybe change things quite dramatically. I think that's probably the biggest difference. I think later Plato sort of caricatures in the negative some of the sophists, so he's not quite fair to them, and I think it's probable that he portrayed Socrates in a more positive light than an unbiased person would. So, like, as a fan of Socrates, probably Plato is exaggerating the virtues of Socrates as compared to the other sophists and exaggerating the vices of the other sophists as compared to Socrates. But I think Aristophanes seems to be overly equating the two, because like not charging a fee for teaching is quite a big difference. It's an important difference.
Yeah, instead of just kind of showing Socrates in a more positive light in virtue of that fact, he even made fun of Socrates' ragtag appearance and whatnot. I think maybe even using it as a guy that is even more in the clouds because he is not worried about his what his clothes look like and whatnot. So even more detached from mundane affairs.
Absolutely. Socrates is so detached, he doesn't understand he actually has to charge for his work.
Still, he married, had kids and whatnot, so money was coming from somewhere. I think maybe his friends and associates were, instead of paying him for lessons, they were gifting him food and foodstuffs and whatnot. Maybe there was a lot of gratitude towards Socrates. That explains why, when he was being trialed in the Apology and then sentenced, the death sentence being carried out in the Phaedo, there's mention of his wife. Her name just blanked out, but she was with a young child in her arms. So even as a late elderly guy, he was having kids.
Yeah. Or there was another thing that I wanted to mention that set him apart from the other sophists. Whereas most of the sophists would be giving lengthy lectures of their own ideas, Socrates made heavy use of questioning his students to draw ideas out of them and to lead them to conclusions. So these would typically be leading questions, but as a pedagogic device to get people to think through issues. It's a different kind of way than sort of making proclamants. And it may have been a bit of an evolving technique from guys like Heraclitus, who would use these very short statements to provoke people into thinking for themselves. So Socrates, instead of using statements to provoke people into thinking themselves, he sort of created an art of asking people questions to get them to think for themselves and to find out how some of their preconceived notions and prior beliefs are maybe not as solid as they thought, and prompting them to revise and improve their, without actually telling them what to believe.
Yeah. I can see that kind of development of ideas. It makes sense.
And I actually can see some of the students wouldn't have considered that drawing the ideas out of them, but rather Socrates just torturing them by not giving them any answers. Tagging.
Yeah, so Socrates did, in fact, torture some people. And a couple of commenters made the point that he would make a big show of him not knowing anything and then shower people like Protagoras and the other sophist in sort of insincere flattery for how wise and knowledgeable they are. And then he would engage in this line of questioning that's a leading line of questioning specifically to show how full of shit they are. And it's mean. It's like you're embarrassing someone on purpose in public while sort of pretending to flatter them. It's like a nasty kind of passive-aggressive kind of thing to do. So, yeah. And
at least how it comes out in the Plato's Dialogues. Yeah,
and Peterson makes it clear that it's kind of obvious why that would be attractive to especially young guys. There's this common thing where like teenage age guys or even guys in their early 20s are like kind of old enough to begin participating in the world of men, but they have not yet earned their stripes. So like the men in their world do not respect them. They haven't earned respect. It's like they kind of get talked down to, and very common reaction for young guys is to get angry and frustrated by being disrespected. and wanting to aggressively fight for respect and fight for their right to fight for their stripes. And that's why it's so easy to, like, one of the reasons it's easy to recruit like young men into armies, whereas like guys who already have settled families and have settled into a position in the social status or the social hierarchy, less easy to convince to go off and fight a war, because they have more to lose and less to win. But yeah, so if Socrates was giving these young guys an example of how they could use their words to go embarrass people of higher status and show like, "Ooh, see, it's a way to fight for your stripes," that I think probably many young guys found quite attractive.
No, I was going to say Socrates' technique was basically he was calling them out and saying, if you are this wise and knowledgeable, show me where I'm wrong. I'm embarrassed. It's like, put up or shut up. I'm showing you where you're foolish. Show me where you're wise. And I can definitely see where, that would have such a huge appeal for the young, because that's the same technique they could use with their elders. Well, if you think you know so much, show me that you actually know it. And again, the elders are just going to sit there and say, I don't have to because I'm elders. And there the conflict lies. Hagen.
Yeah, there's this dichotomy or contrast between people who have a social status that has been bestowed upon them, the older guys, the elite, that have a higher position in the social hierarchy, and then there are these newcomers, the youngsters, who on one side are less emotionally aware and have less self-control because of virtue of their young age. Socrates seemed like, at least in Xenophon's account, to be kind of like a guru on self-development. And from Plato's side, Socrates was also a guy, a wise teacher that taught refined argumentative techniques, rhetoric. And the two things combined, the side of Socrates that Socrates showed to Xenophon and the side that Socrates showed to the more brilliant Plato, combined would probably be very attractive to young guys who want to supercharge their social skills, their competency dealing with the powerful and whatnot, the authorities, and so yeah, it makes sense how Socrates would be like a lamp and the youth would be like moths around the lamp.
Yeah,
definitely Socrates was the cool aged hipster of ancient Athens.
It's funny because when I read Marcus Aurelius writes that Socrates would swagger throughout Athens. So he was so chill and worry-free, like Hakuna Matata, and swaggering around Athens, and just just confronting people, probably with heaps of irony and jokingly as well. And one thing that struck me from Michael Sugrue's lectures was that despite using humor in his conversations with others, Socrates would often address serious things, and the point being that you can talk about serious things and still involve humor. It's not, the two things are not mutually exclusive, and you can still learn from the serious things by using irony and other forms of more highly intellectual humor.
Yes. Sorry, I wanted something that came to mind now. Another way in which Socrates was quite different from several of the other sophists was this charge that Aristophanes made that Socrates had his head in the clouds, actually applied to several of the other philosophers who were very interested in stars and meteorology. And sort of navigation and natural philosophy in general. Whereas with Socrates specifically, not a whole lot of interest in natural philosophy at all, like the skies or the clouds or whatever. Very focused on political ethics and domestic ethics. We focused on what it means to be a virtuous person, and what it means to live a good life. Like highly focused on that. So that's actually quite relatively down to earth in one way, in that the questions are of practical relevance to day-to-day life. There are other ways in which his head was a little bit in the clouds. Like he had I think a very strong, I wanted to say excessive, but just a strong focus on the theoretical aspects of those kinds of questions, and less of an interest in, say, practical day-to-day case studies. So less concerned with concrete evidence and more concerned with abstract principles. So in that sense, head in the clouds, but in the sense of, like, at least about things that have more obvious practical import to everyone's lives, whereas, say, the stars and the weather may have practical import to people navigating at sea, or it may have practical import to farmers specifically deciding when to plant crops and stuff, but not necessarily as broad a practical application as, say, the question of, like, what courage is and how to be more courageous is, like, more generally applicable, I think.
Maybe there's some explanation why Socrates kind of turned his back to natural philosophy, even though he was probably influenced by Anaxagoras, who was really deep into natural philosophy. Socrates kind of ignored it. Maybe he dabbled in it in his early career, as Peter Adamson remarks, but he kind of focused on human nature especially, and the disciplines of philosophy related to that: ethics, morality, self-development. And probably it was because the Athenian society in post-war, post-Peloponnesian War, was reeling from the aftermath of the war. The problems derived from human behavior were much more glaring than people needing to figure out how to use the stars to crop optimally or navigate by sea. And these things were more or less, I think, solved by the Athenians, the Ionians, in a way that allowed for much trade and the use of naval fleets in war. And so maybe these two things, Socrates didn't see much of a point of kind of trying to refine a few fields that had maybe no more gains or were in the dwindling gains kind of curve, while there was much work to do in human nature related kind of pursuit.
Yeah, both of you hit on another area which I think is important there, and that was the area of the astronomy and all that one. It was important to the elite as to when to declare war, how to do the omens, how to do the auguries and such. And I think that Socrates was, again, following the traditional philosophy thing, trying to sever that connection with the gods and the supernatural. So you need to decide based off of human ones, not off of what the stars say as far as that one. So by focusing more directly on the human interactions and the political aspects, as opposed to the natural philosophy, he's also breaking, that sort of connection for the, controlling human affairs based off of what the stars say. Tagging.
I also have here a couple of slides on the other two authors on Socrates. When you guys think we can go forward. So Xenophon. So Socrates was kind of like a war hero, but Xenophon took this thing of being a war hero even further, because He even went across the enemy lines deep into the Persian Empire to try to remove Cyrus from power with a bunch of other Greek hoplites. They failed, and then they had to return. So he is a guy that clearly faced some hardships in his life. He knows what deprivation means, even beyond normal warfare. This guy returned from a really risky endeavor. He also shows Socrates clashing repeatedly with sophists, much like Plato. And he defended Socrates posthumously, as we mentioned. And I think Xenophon is maybe Socrates even died while Xenophon wasn't at Athens, and then he returned and wrote about Socrates, if I'm not wrong. He emphasized Socrates as a paradigm of virtue, but in more down-to-earth terms. Peter Adamson even alluded to Socrates in Xenophon's perspective being kind of like an advice columnist, or maybe a self-development or self-help guru in some senses. Xenophon also talks about, just like Plato, that Socrates had a divine sign that prevented him to write his defense speech and other activities that were being predicted by this divine sign as being harmful. So I kind of jokingly compare this to Spider-Man's Spidey sense, that kind of automatically warns of impending danger so that Spider-Man would avoid the danger. And pretty much in the same way, Socrates, when he's about to do something wrong or foolish or whatnot, his divine sign warns him to not do that. And so, in a sense, if we want to be upstanding human beings, we will have to do so without such a divine sign. Socrates seems to be playing the ethical obstacle course with help. Xenophon also left the Anabasis, which is the account on his return from Persia, and the Memorabilia, or memoirs of Socrates, where Xenophon writes about Socrates' way of life, especially, and some discussions, even one called a Symposium, which might confuse some people, because there's a symposium by Xenophon, and there's also a symposium by Plato. And yeah, go ahead, guys. What do you think about Xenophon?
The comment about making Socrates into something of an advice columnist was funny, especially paired with the comment that Peter Adamson thinks Xenophon is considerably duller than Plato, and so his version of Socrates is also a lot less interesting than Plato.
He had other gifts, like Raphael Wolf jokingly said in the interview episode. Yeah, he for sure had other gifts, as being really a guy that really showed courage in his life.
No, I was going to sit there and say that Socrates is an advice columnist. He's the advice columnist who only asks questions back. But as far as Xenophon goes, I'm just going to correct a little of the details. He was actually in the employ of Cyrus the Younger. He was trying to overthrow the emperor of the Persian Empire, which is Artaxerxes II. And they were basically hired there. They marched all the way to, into the Persian Empire, fought the battle. They actually won the battle. Unfortunately, Cyrus the Younger died during the battle, so their employer was gone. They didn't have any money to get paid, and they basically were going to be hunted by Anaxaxerxes, and they headed across the desert, and that was called the 10,000. And Xenophon was voted as their leader for that trip across the desert. And how they did it was basically get rid of everything. Get rid of your armor, anything, lighten your load, and we're just going to try to outpace them. And that's that. And the Anabasis is basically the story of how they went back to Greece from there. And no, he's almost more of a historian in a lot of ways in this sense from that one. And the point with Socrates is that was his daemon, basically his Jiminy Cricket, guardian angel, whatever you want to say, and that always basically gave him the advice. He'd always consulted as to, is this the right idea or not? And from what I remember, Socrates was actually surprised when he was offered the chance to leave Athens and live rather than face the death penalty. And he consulted the daemon, and the daemon basically, he was surprised. Socrates was surprised. The daemon sat there and said, "No, staying's the right call." Tagging on that.
Yeah, I think that I also in the past heard it referred to as a daemon rather than a sign. But every time I heard it, it's that the daemon or the sign would not sort of tell Socrates what to do. Just every now and then, it would tell Socrates not to do something that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And so Socrates would abstain from things every now and then with the voice of the daemon or the sign telling him not to do certain things.
Not sure if the not telling what to do thing is exactly identical for Xenophon and Plato. For Plato, for sure, Plato stressed that the daemon or divine sign would warn Socrates not to do things, but would never tell Socrates what to do. But perhaps it's similar or the same for both.
Not too sure about that. But so, like, even this, I've seen people try to turn Socrates into kind of a secular alternative for a religious teacher. This supposedly secular version of a religious teacher had a hotline to a deity and was anointed by an oracle who also had a hotline to a deity.
So that's a big epic fail of trying to get a prophet for the atheists. Better luck next time. Yeah.
I was going to say that's typical human nature. I was going to say that's typical of human nature. You turn Socrates into something he never intended to be well after he's dead and can't defend himself anymore. Tag him.
Yeah, and Plato really did just that, and only a few years after Socrates' death. So, as for Plato, supposedly he was a wrestler during his early life. Even his original name was really fortunately that he was surnamed or got the nickname Plato because his real name is something like Aristocles, which would confuse the hell out of many students studying the succession: Socrates, Aristocles, Aristoteles. So fortunately, someone had the sense of calling this guy Plato. According to Diogenes Laertius, who talked about these philosophers from the first ones to the Epicurus, basically, with Socrates in the middle. He would say that Plato probably got this name because he had a wide chest or a big forehead or something like that, but he wasn't sure. But we must thank the guys that surnamed him Plato. But he, besides practicing wrestling during his early life, maybe even participating in the Olympic Games, he was a brilliantly talented playwright who, in his early adulthood, has written a few plays. And he found Socrates around the age of 20. He was so awestruck, according to the modern teacher on philosophy, Michael Sagru, that Plato immediately burnt all his plays and became a disciple of Socrates. That was how awed he was by Socrates. He thought this all that I've been doing right now, it's rubbish. It doesn't matter. And maybe his plays were even kind of superficial, didn't have any substance to it, and he found so much substance in Socrates that he really by contrast thought that everything he had written was trash and worthy of being burnt. So this is one of the less malignant ways in which we lost texts from a supposedly brilliant guy from the past. He burnt it himself. And Socrates' death, his master's death, was probably emotionally wrecking for Plato. He was probably very frustrated, even though by average lifespan, Socrates was 71 years old. Nature would take its course more decade, less decade after that fateful day of 399 BC, when Socrates drank the hemlock. And Plato, according to Sugru, wrote Socrates as a hero to surpass the Homeric epics, to surpass Achilles' valor and Odysseus's wit. And so Socrates was, the uber guy, maybe the Superman. Plato claims Socrates engaged in a noble sophistry, as opposed to what the other sophists were doing. And Socrates wanted to attain the truth instead of blinding people to the truth. Plato left more than 30 dialogues. We had even more supposed dialogues from the left from the Middle Ages, but some of those were considered spurious or forgeries, and so probably we have 35 dialogues from Plato, and almost all of them featuring Socrates in the main role.
No, I was going to say I always like the legends around Plato's birth, where he almost has like a divine birth, where his mother became pregnant from a vision, and then you have the story about how as a baby he was sleeping, and then bees settled on his lips, a sign that he was going to have a sweet style with his discourse. So, I always like that. Even with philosophers, they have to throw in something of the legendary and mythical. Always fun. Tag.
Yeah, that's funny. I like that he was a wrestler. I don't do Greco-Roman wrestling, but I do jiu-jitsu, and we start on our knees, so we're grappling on the floor, which is mostly wrestling. Can recommend. Go away to stay healthy and keep fit and keep the mind active, because it's technically very involved.
Yeah, definitely gonna agree with the wrestler part. One of the images I always liked is the idea that if Plato couldn't beat you in a philosophical argument, he'd just put you in a headlock and submit you afterwards instead. Tag.
Yeah. Also, to bring these three sources of Socrates together, I tried my best to put the characteristics that they would attribute to Socrates together, to see if some pattern emerges here that might point us towards something akin to what Socrates really was. So, of course, for Aristophanes, Socrates was indistinct from the so-called pre-Socratics or Ionian, Magna-Grecian, or Sophists. For him, traditional gods didn't exist, and he ends up inventing new ones, the clouds. Aristophanes ridiculed Socrates' voluntary indigence, barefoot, ragtag appearance, showed him as obsessed with meteorology, which conflicts in absolute with the other two guys, and comes off as conceitedly divine. I don't know if you guys felt it, but when we were doing the dialogue, when we were doing the reading, he kind of addresses his interlocutor as if from above and calls him an ephemeral or a mortal. And so he's kind of, without saying it directly, he's kind of saying, I'm above mortals and I'm above humans. And so he, just to even further damage Socrates' reputation, even represented him as being so conceited as thinking of himself as a divine himself. While Xenophon and Plato show Socrates clashing with the sophists, while Xenophon's Socrates gives life advice mostly, Plato shows him as being very philosophical, and his body of work, his dialogues, Socratic dialogues, shows Socrates tackling some of the biggest questions of philosophy ever since, and still today. These big questions are not fully satisfactorily answered, like what is justice, what is wisdom in contrast to ignorance, is goodness something that comes from the decree of the gods, or are things good in themselves and the gods just like things that are good? So and also, of course, the nature of the gods and the nature of learning as well, emphasizing that learning is something that is more akin to remembering, instead of stuff being implanted into the minds of learners. They both, Xenophon and Plato, portray knowledge as a virtue in itself. Also, Socrates, in Xenophon's perspective, is a bit more hubristic, a bit more arrogant, claims to be favored by the gods with his divine sign and also the proclamation from the oracle. Peter Adamson mentions that Socrates stopped short of calling himself a god, just by being favored by Apollo's oracle. Xenophon also says that he would not ask for a fee from associates, which matches with what Plato says. And also, both of them agree that he didn't engage in physical sciences at all, or natural philosophy. While Xenophon shows Socrates as stunningly arrogant, especially in the Apology. Xenophon and Plato both report on the Apology or Socrates' trial. And while Xenophon shows him as being stunningly arrogant and conceited with his excellence, or being kind of self-aware of his excellence, or claiming excellence, Plato may be representing the real Socrates or not, or kind of sanitizing the real Socrates, shows Socrates as more a guy that claims ignorance from the start of any conversation, shows himself as being unaware of his own virtue. Please forgive the typo. And he didn't avoid his death, pretty much in the same sense as Xenophon as well. So this is a kind of a bringing together of these portrayals of Socrates.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on this. Xenophon portraying Socrates as very arrogant and conceited, and Socrates being shown as less arrogant and conceited in Plato. Like, we upset or offended someone yesterday by talking about Plato as a kind of elitist. But there are elements of Socrates' thought that can be considered quite arrogant, even though he's well known for his what seems a humble position, is that he claims to know that he doesn't know. There's some assumptions based in his claim to know that he doesn't know that are maybe less certain than they might appear, and holding them very, very strongly and unreflectively isn't exactly intellectually humble. And then there are some value claims that he made about what kind of life is even worth living, can be construed as very arrogant. So one of his famous quotes, even in Plato, that supposedly show him as humble, is saying the unexamined life is not worth living. And by examined life, presumably, or it seems from context quite clear that he meant the kind of life that he was living, this kind of intellectual life of having conversations, trying to arrive at definitions of things like justice and virtue and wisdom and that kind of thing. And that strikes me as potentially extremely arrogant thing. Like the only life that is that's better than killing yourself is having endless discussions about the definitions of words like wisdom and justice and courage. And so people who spend their time nursing the sick or tending the elderly or training the young in other ways than endlessly asking them questions about definitions, or maybe teaching them mathematics or teaching them manual labor skills, or doing things other than endlessly talking about definitions, all those kinds of lives, not even worth living. Those people would be better off killing themselves. What they should rather do is spend all their time talking about definitions, which, if that's not arrogant, I don't know what is.
I was going to say, I can't go quite so far as to saying that Socrates thought they should kill themselves, just that it wasn't worth living. Not being worth living doesn't mean you're necessarily worth killing yourself over. So, I kind of think of it as that's the one that he sees as most valuable. And Socrates questions why anybody else would want to live a life that wasn't that way. But I was going to say, go ahead.
In that case, he wasn't asking a question like, why is your life tending homely matters, raising children and feeding your livestock or whatever? He didn't ask them, why do you think this is even worth doing? Well, mind you, he did ask questions like that. But he also made explicitly saying, like, no, I think my way of examining my life is the only kind of life that's worth living at all for anyone in any time in any place.
Yeah, but to be fair, Xenophon and Plato's Socrates would often even use certain jobs like a doctor to serve as a building example, to show that just like you don't seek a doctor that is incompetent or a quack to heal your body, you also don't want to choose a leader for government that is completely worthless as a politician or a leader. And so I don't think he would go so far as to kind of advocate this kind of nihilistic some lives are worth others, or at least some individuals are worth more than others. I think he shows some compassion for humanity as a whole, although I can't cite specific points here about this. But for instance, he wanted to teach even a slave some geometry. And he showed that even the slave is capable of learning, and so maybe there's some philanthropical aspect on Socrates as well, not just elitism. Maybe Plato himself might be a bit more elitistic than Socrates, perhaps, but it's difficult to be sure. I think it's also worthwhile to explain the Socratic method as well. But if you guys want to address any point now, we can.
Yeah, so I'd also like to talk about the Socratic method a bit, but
well, let me follow.
Some more to say about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead, Nerdalia, and I do have some follow up to yours too. So you finish first.
I'm happy with you to go, because it's highly related to what we're talking about, but it's slightly following up. So.
Okay, no, I was going to say, one of the things that I think we absolutely have to recognize, that in Socrates' decided way of living actually led him to kill himself. So, that one is his way of living actually does lead him to kill himself. Now, as far as that, him knowing nothing, I think that reflects a certain amount of arrogance in that he's projecting it onto other people, because he's not simply saying I'm ignorant, he's saying everybody's ignorant and so are you, based off of the fact that he's ignorant. And that part of his argument is inherently arrogant on that one. And last one I'd like to touch on Plato and him burning his plays. At least Kafka left that in his will for people to do. And the reason we have Kafka's work is because people didn't burn it for him. But I'm going to tag out on that one because I wanted to make a point about Socrates did kill himself and based off of his way of living. Tag.
Yeah, and apparently Socrates killed himself without even batting an eye or without showing any anxiety or stress or whatnot, very calmly and very intentionally drank the poison. Also, I think that the idea or the self-proclamation of ignorance, especially in the beginning of dialogues or when a new idea is presented, Socrates kind of proclaims that he doesn't know a lot about it. It might have different possible interpretations. For one, it could be a ruse to make the other person kind of overly confident or at least at ease to talk with Socrates. So maybe they haven't yet heard about Socrates being a genius. And since he says that he wants to be their student, almost, as Socrates sometimes says to his interlocutors, that he wants to learn from them, even, he's kind of highlighting one important point, which is it's way more conducive to the practice of philosophy and this continuous movement towards wisdom or knowledge and away from ignorance, to keep thinking instead of just grabbing the first shiny idea or shiny answer that appears.
Yeah, so I don't think Socrates ever claimed to know absolutely nothing, but he made a similar claim that's also quite a strong claim. He said that what he wants to have is true wisdom, and by comparison, what he does have is worthless. So he knows things, but it's just that those things aren't really worth knowing. The things that are worth knowing, he doesn't know. And yeah, so the things that are worth knowing are basically, it seems like perfect accounts, or perfect, absolutely flawless, absolutely completely unproblematic theories of things like justice and wisdom and virtue. And those aren't around even still today. Like, there are many theories around. All of them are problematic in one way or another, and there are very deep reasons for why basically any kind of account will almost necessarily be problematic in some way. But so it is quite a strong claim to go from, yeah, so what we really want is the perfect claim, and everything even slightly less than perfection, worthless. No value whatsoever. It's a strong position. And yeah, there's some other like positions of his that I maybe like to challenge, but there's a point if we're going to talk about his methodology. The way of his questioning is basically asking leading questions to show that some account of something like wisdom or of piety or of justice or of courage or whatever is in some way problematic. That can basically be used to show any kind of account of more or less any philosophical concept is problematic. We have some choices when ascribing meaning to different words, and those choices come with different pros and cons. None of them are absolutely without cons. So basically, I take a similar approach to philosophy as I do to, say, statistics. So the statistician George Box says all statistical models are wrong, but some of them are useful. Slightly adapted to philosophy, like all philosophical doctrines are problematic, some of them are useful. But what Socrates is doing is he's saying, well, given that there's any kind of problematic anything about any philosophical theory that renders that entire philosophical theory completely worthless. And his method can basically be used to find any kind of problem with any kind of well, not necessarily any kind of problem. It can always be used to find some kind of problem with any philosophical position, including the couple of positions that he takes. So this kind of position that he takes, where anything short of perfection is worthless, is a philosophical position and is highly problematic. And I'm not using his method. I'm sort of using the more standard expository method to claim that I think is problematic. But his method could be used to do that. And one thing he was accused of by a lot of people who were annoyed by him in refusing to state his position, which almost of necessity had beliefs about things. But in refusing to state his beliefs, what he thinks justice is, what he thinks wisdom is, or just by saying, I don't know, you tell me, he's basically making himself invulnerable to the same kind of attack, like passive-aggressive attack he's making to others. So whatever position they take, he can use his method to show why it's problematic, and hence why anything they do is worthless. And from the start, he just says, well, anything I have is worthless anyway. So, and then there's no attack showing that, there's no possibility of attacking him back. But like a much healthier discussion would be saying, like, well, the beliefs you have certain virtues to them, like there's certain value, certain usefulness. Like we can learn things about the world, and if we act in them in certain ways, they'll have certain advantages and disadvantages, and maybe my beliefs differently. That's like a more pragmatic approach to it, and we can share and we can exchange ideas. This kind of one-sided saying, you think you're so great, I'll show you you're worthless. Not a healthy kind of discussion, I don't think.
Yeah, to be fair, this was also in the context of many dialogues in which Plato wanted to kind of strawman and trash a bunch of sophists and political leaders. And he wielded the character Socrates to the maximum effect that his literary skills allowed it. And so we see a lot of irony upon irony, Socrates leading them into a really checkmate kind of position. And so, well, Peter Adamson even believes that the Plato character Socrates probably isn't close to the historical Socrates. We can't even extract the historical Socrates from Plato. So that is Peter Adamson's position. Raphael Wolf seems more in line with, okay, maybe possibly the earliest dialogues, including the Apology and whatnot, probably were closer to the historical Socrates. And so that being said, it's very, very difficult to make character judgments on the historical individual Socrates due to this confusion that we either have a satirist portraying a character named after him, or a historian guy that saw a very narrow aspect of the guy and not a lot of material to go with. And then a guy who wrote a lot of material, but he was a creative genius and he had some axe to grind against a lot of the elite of Athens. And so we are left in this hopeless position of, okay, yeah, we can be judgmental about the Socrates character by Plato. Yeah, he definitely rhetorically trashes these guys, and these guys are even being represented as supposed caricatures of them, like Protagoras and Gorgias, who were maybe more noble than they appear in Plato's dialogues. And then Socrates is kind of like a philosophical superhero that remembers everything that they say, even long speeches and whatnot. He forgets nothing, and he has always really great questions to make, and he never assumes an argument or a position. It's almost like trying to fist fight with a ghost that can punch you, but you can't punch the ghost back.
No, I think you hit really well on that one. One of the things that I noticed about Socrates is to a certain extent his claims of ignorance. He's kind of wandering in the same quagmire Descartes was in later with his with his doubt, with Descartes, with his doubt. And that's where it's like Socrates couldn't really find his way out. And if we want to move on to the Socratic method, I'm cool with that at this point. Tag.
Yeah. Would you like to add something, Nerdalium, or we'll talk about the Socratic method?
There are a couple of more things about some of the positions attributed to Socrates that I'd like to go over, but I can maybe come back to those things after talking a little bit about the method.
Yeah. Okay. So the Socratic method, in a nutshell, is a process that is supposed. The end of this process is to make people more wise than they started with, or more learned. And so learning facilitated by the teacher asking questions to the student. This can be taken to an extreme, as Peter Adamson warns. For instance, if a student makes a straightforward question to which the teacher knows the answer and can give the answer easily, withholding the answer and continuing to ridiculously ask questions related to answers like specific dates or something will really waste people's time. So it must be used when it is a good tool for the occasion, and this is even seen in Plato's dialogues. Some of the dialogues are back and forth with questions and answers, like in the Republic, where Socrates corners Thrasymachus until Thrasymachus even blushes. But there are also parts in the dialogues in which either of the interlocutors go into a speech or a monologue. And so there's also the expositive or exposition method, however we might call it, in play as well. So some people that talk about the Socratic method as being something that might be equated to the only thing that Socrates does is not really correct. But it's a great way to pick up on, as we've mentioned, Heraclitus or the Buddhist koans kind of approach of trying to promote thought in the other person. But using a question, which is even more, I think, effective at promoting thoughts, because people can just listen to a statement and move on to the next thing. But people kind of get emotionally and mentally entangled with questions, with unanswered questions. And it kind of, if a question is well posed, it might make the mind race even. Which if it does so to a young adult or a youth, it might be good because it will be a means to promote autonomous thought and people reaching certain conclusions about a field by themselves, which seems to correlate to a better quality output of learning. As opposition to kind of like people spilling information into our minds that goes into one ear and goes out of the other. And so, well, that's all I have to say for an introduction to the Socratic method.
Yeah. So as a teaching tool, sort of leading questions in general can be very powerful. The dynamic's very different if the teacher is willing to honestly also state what they believe. And in many cases, intellectual humility would require the teacher to acknowledge that these are beliefs. It's not something they know with certainty that they can prove conclusively. But Socrates was very reluctant even to share his beliefs. And yeah, so also as a method of showing someone who's quite arrogant that their beliefs in fact constitute knowledge, it can be a very effective tool to embarrass them, to show that their beliefs are problematic and isn't as certain as they pretend or falsely believe to be or pretend to be in public.
I would like to address that. For instance, in the Phaedo, which is the dialogue about the last moments of Socrates, even though it seems that Socrates doesn't explicitly say that the soul is immortal and there is the transmigration of the souls and whatnot, the point is very, very clear. Even if he doesn't state it with statements, with affirmations, he's dialoguing with Pythagoreans who are kind of doubting their own doctrine of the immortality of the soul, and Socrates is giving really strong arguments, at least in the context of the dialogue, for the soul, since the soul is what gives life, and what gives life henceforth must have the property of life itself, or the form of life. You cannot remove life, the property of life, from the soul itself. And so even though the body can die, since the soul is something that cannot be killed or molested in the physical world, henceforth the soul is immortal, and that is one of his positions. Another position is that people learn by remembering instead of by acquiring information. But I think there are more. There are more. Another position by Socrates is virtues are a monolith or a whole, and different virtues, like virtue, justice, courage, and temperance, are like facets of this body of virtue that Plato usually portrays as metaphorically as the sun.
No, I was going to say, one of the points that I see on the Socratic method is it can kind of rub people the wrong way, in the sense of Socrates is sort of laying low, letting them take the position, and then asking them leading questions, and then playing gotcha at the very end. And again, I see Plato using that to great effect, and he's using Socrates as a literary foil for that aspect. But going to tag on that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of positions that Socrates is sort of considered, well, it's considered fairly sure that those are his positions. And so one of these positions is the unity of virtue, and that all virtue comes down to a kind of knowledge, that this is this theoretical kind of knowledge that would enable you to give an unproblematic definition of either virtue as a whole or the kinds of virtues. And so there's a bunch of assumptions about the nature of virtue that goes into the arguments for that position that are highly problematic, and that the Socratic method could have been used to show are problematic. And so for one of the things Socrates seems to like, one of the positions he seems to hold is that people can't be expected to reliably give examples or reliably judge examples of whether something is virtuous or not without like a perfect definition of what that virtue is. So people can't, given a story like a fable, people can't reliably judge whether it's an example of wisdom or an example of courage without having like a perfect definition of wisdom or courage. And like one example in just a different domain that shows that maybe people can have the ability to recognize patterns without the ability to define the pattern in a completely unproblematic way is just say the basic familiarity with geometric shapes. So if hard pressed, I'd wager that the majority of the world's population will not be able to give a sound set theoretic definition of something like a circle. If you ask them, please, like, what is a circle? Can you define a circle for me? They're not going to come up with a sound mathematical definition of what a circle is. And yet you can show them a pair of a circle and a triangle, or a circle and a tree, or a circle and a dog, and a circle and a table, and a circle and a person, and a circle. They will never mistake the person for a circle, or the circle for a person, or mistake a circle for a triangle or a triangle. They'll get it right almost every time. There may be some really edge cases with shapes that are kind of circles, but like some people would say like, yeah, that's a circle, and other people would say no, that's not a circle, and there may be some disagreements. But if you can have like a very large variety of very obvious circles that people won't judge incorrectly, even though they're incapable of giving a definition of circle. And so that position of his highly problematic and counterproductive if what you're trying to do is learn to cultivate virtue, as we've seen in other cultures have made good use of example stories, case studies, and fables, and to teach their young children lessons in virtue, which in the Socratic tradition is worthless. Like those examples are worthless unless you have a definition. And so just endless generations of fruitless toil to arrive at definitions that aren't necessary and aren't possible, rather than doing something more productive that come up with really good examples.
Yeah, but it doesn't come to me that he is a purist in that sense, because he kind of, in the Phaedrus, which is a dialogue about love, with a youngster that is being adored by another guy. So it also shows the normalization of homosexuality in ancient Greece. But the youngster shared with Socrates a speech that the other guy that adored him wrote for him, and then the speech was like really superficial and vain, and was more about physical attraction than love. Then Socrates does his first speech about love, but it's a wrong speech. It's a wrong example. And his daimon kind of informs him that he must fix his mistake. And he then does a second speech, but it also kind of gives a nice story, because he tells the story that when two people are in love, it's like they are kind of rising together in love, in a sense. And he uses metaphorical imagery of horses driving horses that fly, that drive a chariot up towards the realm of the gods, or the divine realm, or the realm of forms, or whatnot. But of course, we also see in the Platonic dialogues this pet peeve that Plato has, which is Plato is, of course, obsessed with his metaphysical take on the world. And he wants to interpret the entire world, everything that happens in the world and every object in the world, in relationship with what he calls forms, which inhabit the realm of forms, which is, to me, a kind of a repository of uncontingent knowledge, to kind of reference Leibniz, who probably was influenced by all this, in opposition with contingent knowledge. Like Alexander the Great died in certain date, but that is contingent knowledge. But if we talk about triangles having three sides, no matter in which planet you are, triangles will have three sides, because the very name and definition of a triangle is intimately related to the essential properties of the triangle itself. And so since these two things are inextricable from each other, the concept of a triangle and the definition of a triangle, this is uncontingent knowledge, and it's much more certain knowledge than contingent knowledge. And this even inspires me to think about knowledge not as every single bit of knowledge is equally important, like fundamental laws of physics, or the theory of everything, or what really is virtue, as being in the same level of importance as what did your neighbor eat last night, or something like that from gossip. And so I think that although caste systems shouldn't be applied to human beings, I definitely think that we each individually should filter knowledge in a scale of importance.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I tend to go a little more Kantian there, and I see that as a priori analytic knowledge. That's where the forms fall into for me. So just tagging on that note.
Yeah, it's like a bit of a sidetrack away from Socrates, but I actually quite like in my own use, and I know this goes against Leibniz and Kant, but sort of think of mathematical knowledge like the proofs that derives from theorems as contingent because of like how they follow from basic assumptions about the axioms and the rules of the formal system. So contingent on some constructed rule system and some constructed meaning system, there follow some things. So if we assume these axioms and these rules of inference, then it follows with certainty that the sum of the inner angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, for example. But if we made different assumptions and it was a hyperbolic geometry, we'd get a different result. If we made different assumptions, we get a different result. So the certainty of the theorem that's being proved is contingent on the axioms that are being assumed. Different axiom systems give you different results. But that's like I kind of want to stick to like Socrates and knowledge and virtue and all those things, because I actually think those are quite important topics instead of sort of the cultivation of virtue. Important to linger on, and maybe the sort of highly abstract debates in constructivism versus realism in the philosophy of mathematics a little less.
I completely agree with you. I think before we kind of engage in godly intellectual pursuits, we need to figure out human nature first and fix human nature as best as we can first before we go on to other things. Assuming that if we fix human nature, we have a more stable society that is more propitious for higher flights, for moonshots of philosophy.
Yeah. So I think Socrates. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think I have a feeling that we will come back and revisit a lot of these topics later on. Tag.
Yeah.
Very likely. Actually, practically so. So on the topic of human nature and very related to virtue and stuff, it was one of the positions that Socrates held was that no one errs knowingly. So no one does bad except through ignorance. And he's basically saying, and all anyone ever wants is the good. So all desire is aimed at the good. And like one way of stating that is there's this Greek notion of inner conflict of will or a weakness of will. So wanting to do something and then failing to do it, like as is the case with procrastination. They have a word for that, acrasia. And basically Socrates saying acrasia doesn't make any logical sense. It's not possible. Nobody ever suffers acrasia. So this is the thing that I sort of primed earlier to say. It's one of those things that's like very similar to Zeno, where he makes a fancy argument that all motion is impossible, and you can just kind of go, look, my hand's moving. And he's like, I have an argument why your hand's not moving. And then he makes this argument. Socrates, similarly, he says weakness of will is impossible, and you can just take your pick and show, see that person right there? What are you doing now? Procrastinating. See, that's an example of weakness of the will. Or like, see someone who's smoking, trying to quit smoking. Should you smoke? Yeah, I should smoke. Do you think it would be good to stop smoking? Yes, I think it would be good to stop smoking. Why are you still puffing your cigarette? Example of acrasia. And Socrates would just say like, no, it's like all those empirical examples are just illusory. Here's my argument. And in that, he's kind of following the footsteps of people like Zeno, who would place just almost blind faith in sophistical arguments.
I even have a more extreme example of seeing cancer researchers who were studying specifically the types of cancer that are more deadly, small cell lung cancer, in an institute in Lisbon, and some of them were smoking at the entrance. And so, yeah, this is maybe because they have the technique of knowing that, in a sense, they know in one dimension of knowing that these things happen, that there is these cancer cells and they're caused by smoking and whatnot, and they're studying them, but they haven't had a kind of a gnosis, if I'm using the word correctly, or they haven't acquired Sophia about self-awareness of these dangers. There's nothing there inside of them, like a daemon warning them to not smoke or something like that. Something that overpowers the habit of smoking. And since this subject is so important for self-development, and this is one thing that from studying ancient philosophy from the Far East to the West, there are many thinkers that emphasize and highlight self-knowledge and self-development before even starting to talk about higher pursuits like sophisticated metaphysics and epistemology and whatnot. They really emphasize that for human beings to function, they need to have a good degree of self-awareness of what's going on. And I think it might be used as a possible explanation for why people that have a deadline, a looming deadline, and are instead sitting in the couch, it is probably because the comfort that they are gaining from sitting in the couch is for the time being superior to the reward that they are anticipating or that they are imagining in their mind's eye that will result from the work being done before the deadline.
Mr. Grab?
Oh, I was going to say, I don't know too much what to say to that one. That I can understand. It's sort of like almost they're establishing that decent basis of understanding in order to move on to the higher pursuits. And that's been one of the traditional standards for teaching over the years. Is you have to get through your basis before you can move on to the more advanced subjects. And it seems like in the ancient ones, some of that morality was part of the basics, rather which we've left behind here. And I think that's sort of what Rogerio was kind of hitting on. Going to tag there.
Yeah, I actually think some of the way in which Western philosophy has kind of degenerated away from sound moral principles is like partly to blame here is Plato, and with at least Plato's version of Socrates, because Plato's versions of Socrates is like people like don't have these conflicting desires. They always desire what's good. Everyone, everywhere. The only difference between people that do good and people that do evil is knowledge. And the kind of knowledge is this like theoretical, being able to give the definitions of words knowledge. And so like the only thing worth doing, because it's the only thing that can make the world a better place, is to pursue this kind of knowledge. And various people have noted, like in the 2,500 years since Plato, people have not been able to contribute more than footnotes to sort of Plato's definitions, and it's because these kinds of words are so. Because like these kinds of words are so difficult to define and so context dependent that the definitions that people come up with are problematic in some way or other. Similarly to the definitions that people came up with in Plato's times, also problematic. And so I just think like philosophers in the tradition of Plato have wasted a lot of time and have sort of missed the opportunity to do a lot of good because of this preoccupation with a certain kind of knowledge and this theoretical ability to define the meanings of words like wisdom, and just having endless squabbles just for thousands of years, splitting hairs and in ways that are entirely worthless. I think one of the that one of the Stoics, again, it's Seneca or Cicero, forgive me, I'm not too familiar with the slightly later Hellenic philosophy, said, stop telling, or it may have been Marcus Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius, probably, yeah.
Stop telling me, don't tell me what a good man is, just be one. Yeah. And so that being a good person, as opposed to being the kind of person who can define what it means to be a good person, like those are two different things. And as the example with the sort of circle show, is you don't necessarily need to have a definition that works in all cases in able to tell the difference between like a circle and a triangle. You don't need a definition that works in all cases to be able to tell the difference between a coward and a brave person, between a pious person and an impious person. Like there are many examples where it's like even people who won't be able to give you a definition ever will be able to point out correctly the pious person versus the impious person, or the brave person versus the coward. And they can sort of do practices that get them acting in more courageous ways and get them acting in, I don't know if I want to encourage people to be pious or whatever, but, acting in more virtuous ways, which practices are different practices than giving definitions. And Socrates was basically saying, like, no, the only way to get people to act virtuously is to dispel them of their ignorance, because the only reason anyone ever acts in any kind of unvirtuous way is exactly because of ignorance. And it's exactly because of this specific kind of ignorance, of inability to define specific terms. I think it's a profoundly unproductive approach to ethics and virtue in general.
If I may, we were discussing earlier that, for instance, for a scenario in which we are trying to hire an employee, and one guy shows up who is a greenhorn, doesn't have a lot of technical skills, but he's a really upstanding character kind of guy. He clearly shows virtues in the interview and whatnot, and also has good referrals from other people who know him well, as opposed to a superstar in the field who is a deep narcissist and has really problematic and malignant problems with his personality. He will probably try to step on others in the workplace, just to shine over them and whatnot, or practice any other unethical kind of or immoral behavior. Which one, as a recruiter, would you hire?
Yeah, the good person who is lacking somewhat in technical skills can be trained, can learn the technical skills. So a person highly skilled and have technical knowledge and whatever with deep personality flaws are likely to change, and very difficult to make people to change through training them.
It seems that go ahead, Graham, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it's the economist in me who sits there and says, if I'm the recruiter, which one's going to make my company more money? That's the one I hire. Yeah, because that's the point of the business is amoral. They don't care, the morality of the person. They just want to make more money.
Yeah, okay. And maybe I could have stated the scenario better. The recruiter is also going to be a future colleague. He's also going to work with him daily. So it's not just a kind of a recruiter that's removed and doesn't care what's going to happen in the workplace.
Yeah, no. Too often it goes the way that I just described. One of the things that I find very, very fascinating here is Plato's just disregard for the sophists. And the big complaint about the sophists is how they took pure knowledge and basically twisted it in order to serve their own purposes, in order to basically defend wrongdoing and things like that. And that's where it's almost like the virtues getting baked in almost into as an assumption at this point. I don't know, just something that was striking me there, and also the irony about the use of the sophists and disclaiming the sophists and with their harm of knowledge. Tagging.
The other question here that is related to this question of the employees is, how can we explain that technical skills are way more easy to train than soft skills.
So I would phrase it slightly differently. Technical skills and domain-specific expertise way easier to develop than it is to cure personality disorders.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And even the point about which person is going to make the company more profit, unlikely that the person with a personality disorder is going to make the company more profit. So like real personality disorders are dysfunctional for both the individual suffering it and the people around them.
Yeah.
And so like even the kind of people who do the company well are the kind of people who can actually find ways to serve the company interests, even at the expense of their own interests. And so sometimes oftentimes those are made to overlap so that people can pursue their own interests by pursuing company interests. And so there's maybe a willingness to violate other people's rights and boundaries in order to serve company and individual interest that can be associated with personality disorders. But in order to do that well, there's a level of functioning that's required that goes beyond what a lot of people with personality disorders have at all. So if you have this like really unvirtuous person, like someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, they struggle to do the kind of understanding and perspective taking that's necessary to do even exploitative business strategies. Because it's like one of the things that narcissists struggle with is empathically taking perspective. Like if a person can empathically take perspective and then uses that ability to take advantage of people, that's not necessarily narcissistic. It could be a trait of, it could be some other trait, but narcissists typically have this real difficulty of baked in. But right now it's not
Yeah,
for
sure.
Not about personality disorders.
For sure, there are fields of work like sales representatives or marketing or whatnot, in which people are dealing with other people on a continuous basis, in which personality problems, lack of virtue, may be much more damaging or much more visible than, for instance, a guy who takes care of the DevOps of the hardware and computers and whatnot in the basement, and he spends almost all the day without seeing other people. So it's very different. Yeah, I think that to go back to what we think is really urgent and essential to fix and to solve, and as Socrates was also seemingly trying to solve, is okay. So there are these virtues. They're called courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. What do they even mean? We have words for them, which is almost worthless, because words are like signposts or symbols that point. For instance, the word for dog points at dogs in the real world, and we can clearly see that happening because it points at something that physically exists in the real world. We can go and check for ourselves that there is a dog, and the dog smells like a dog, has fur like a dog, etc., etc., behaves like a dog. But can we do that for stuff of metaphysics, like the concept of courage? Can we, by thinking about the word courage, kind of see where the word is pointing at and see this concept for what it is, really precisely and accurately, so as to even distinguish it from other similar things like other virtues? Like, can we even do that? This is really, really difficult. It's really hard because we're talking about things that are extremely important for human behavior, according to this model of thought of virtues as being important components of the human soul, according to what the ancient Greeks thought. And we clearly see people being courageous systematically, or some people being courageous sporadically. Maybe people that are being courageous sporadically are just, they just felt inspired in the moment, and can't easily replicate that kind of courageous acts, while some people are systematically and consistently courageous. And so this also alludes to another bit of position of Socrates, which is knowledge that we know where it comes from, or that we can understand, is way better than knowledge that we acquired haphazardly or by chance. Tagging out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
No, I agree.
On the question of whether we can define things like courage, we can give useful working definitions. I don't think we can give perfect definitions. I don't think we can achieve this level of absolute, flawless, unproblematic in any sense definition of any of the virtues. Don't think we need those kinds of definitions. I think a working definition that leaves us with some questions about gray areas and edge cases is good enough for the majority of life. And several people have offered definitions, so we can sort of shop around and compare and pick up a working definition and work with it, work on ourselves using those definitions. And I think Socrates' complaint that, well, it's not real knowledge unless it's perfect. Well, fine then, if you don't want to call it knowledge, but I'm going to call it worth spending my time on. If you want to say, no, my life is not worth living because I'm not endlessly worrying about how it's not perfect knowledge, then you go do you someplace else. Thank you very much.
You make some fair points that I agree with. Just to really quickly say it, I think it's way more important to know how to guide ourselves or others towards the acquisition of courage or other virtues than to know exactly what courage is.
I was going to sit there and say a lot of what we're talking about kind of is the issues Plato was solving with his cave and the forms, where the forms were those perfect definitions and those perfect things of everything. Here is the flawed aspect of it. And one of the aspects that Socrates is kind of, those assumptions that things are based off of, he's making the assumptions that people recognize that things like virtue exist. That's something that a lot of people even argue about these days. So trying to sit there and say they were coming off of a more limited, or maybe a larger assumption set than what we're wrestling with today. Tagging.
That's why today we talk about people having upstanding characters instead of using the vocabulary of virtue, unless people are super interested in Stoicism. But for the most part, people that are coming from even some at least superficial knowledge of psychoanalysis and other prevalent models of behavior, it's much more useful to realize the expectations in terms of symbols of other people. It makes us better communicators, for one. It makes us better educators as well. And also it opens the possibility for us to also extract some lessons or wisdom of worth from other people if we know how to kind of use symbols as keys.
Yeah, so in modern times, in my training in industrial psychology, the word virtue wasn't used much at all, but a similar contemporary psychological term that gets thrown around a lot in psychology is the word competence. And it's a very rich theoretical construct, and it's problematic, but it gets used in human resource management to great effect, and it can be used in personal development to great effect. It's considered to have different components, knowledge being one component, skills being a different component. Abilities refer to sort of the potentials to acquire traits. And then there are a bunch of different character traits that are sort of thrown in a category called other traits, which are stuff like attitudes or emotional awareness, self-awareness, or role fittedness can. So in some cases, gender can be important for a specific role, and they include gender in there, but it's case specific. But yeah, it's not all knowledge, and so like there are a couple of people who make a big deal like the solution to everything is knowledge and just knowledge, and the only thing it's worth spending time on is acquiring knowledge. Lands very odd to my ears. It seems there are more things in life worth spending time on than just knowledge, even though knowledge, depending on what kind of knowledge, but some kinds of knowledge can be extremely valuable.
We also must take into account one thing. We are basing ourselves on the English translations of Plato's dialogues. And as we've talked about, mentioned previously, knowledge in ancient Greek had several words with nuanced applications or nuanced meanings. And so sometimes only by either learning Greek itself, the source language of the text, or studying multiple translations, can we figure out better what Plato's Socrates is saying. And so he might be saying in some dialogues that knowledge is important intellectually, but in others he might be saying that knowledge as self-knowledge, like from the Oracle of Delphi, self-knowledge and Sophia and whatnot, and a deep self-mastery is super important for virtue. And so these things are really different.
Yeah, no, I was going to say one aspect about the difference of the words is the way our vocabulary has expanded, and we have a lot of the meanings that they gave to words like wisdom back in, then they had so many fewer words. It had a whole lot more connotations that we've since then parsed out and separated with our new words that we use it instead of that one root word that they used back in ancient Greece. And I'd like to just note my personal opinion that the term human resource is an oxymoron, and the whole narcissist aspect in corporate culture, it tends to correlate the higher up the food chain you go, because when you reach the top, you want those people who are desensitized to the emotions of the employees to make decisions. That's who the stockholders want as a CEO, for better and for worse. So going to tag on those.
Yeah, like the sophists that were technically quite competent, especially at influencing others. But they didn't have any scruples. They didn't have any moral integrity. So just as before, so we see now some patterns that are similar.
Yeah, we've spoken quite a lot, so I'm kind of keen to close up, and I'd like to actually just close up on some place where I'm actually in agreement with Socrates and have some appreciation for him. So besides his reputation as being a good teacher, which I think is a noble thing to be in life and maybe undervalued in lots of quarters these days. I also really like his priority of caring for one's soul, sort of nurturing and cultivating one's soul. We've spoken a little bit about that, but yeah, you can. In one dialogue, he compares himself to a midwife, where instead of giving birth to specific or to people, he's helping people give birth to ideas that sort of ennoble his soul, or ennoble their souls. So he's and that's, you consider that a very important thing to do. So maybe overstating just how much other lives are not worth living, but I do think sort of cultivating souls and cultivating virtue and growing up and growing into be better people and helping others do the same, really important. So good guy Socrates on that front.
And I also admire his position in this phrase here. He positions himself not as the bearer of the truth, much less the truth itself, but he's saying that despite the authority that someone might confer him by perception or whatnot, to oppose the argument for itself, regardless of where it comes from. Well, I think that if someone has this kind of level-headedness, even nowadays, even for instance, a senior guy at a group or an organization or something, that still talks with newer people like as if they are peers, and treats them as peers, and accepts being shown wrong, that's much more conducive to things working well, and it's probably related to some virtue here happening according to the Greek model.
Yeah, no, what Socrates is saying there is very much echoed by, actually Socrates is echoing the Buddha, since the Buddha lived earlier. Yeah. And that's the idea of, it's not whether I'm right or not, it's whether what, the test of truth is within the person beholding it. And even though I said it, don't go with that appeal to authority. And as far as for Socrates, one of the things that stands out to me is, again, just he lived that wholly genuine, integrated life. Everything of him was 100% consistent. He talked the talk, he walked the walk, and again, drank the drink that killed him. So,
yeah,
gonna tag out.
It's Heraclitus. I just had to Google that really quickly. Who had a similar thing, where he said, just pulling up the quote, listening to listening not to me but to the logos. Damn it, browser. You play it wrong. Listening not to me but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. So that whole sort of, don't take my word for it, take the truth for it, take the truth for what it is on its own terms.
Yeah, or as the Eastern guys would say, Buddha or Hinduism, rather Buddha, and also I think Lao Tzu said this, don't look at the finger pointing at the moon, look at the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's we can go our separate ways, and hopefully next week we are back for getting ourselves more entrenched into Plato's Socrates. Will be, I think, a well with these two guys.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Graham. Had a lot of fun doing that, and again, thank you for patience with my contrarianism.
Oh, you play the role of the contrarian very well, which is important. Otherwise, there cannot be any dialectic.
Don't worry, I'll pick up that role coming up here. I want to say, yeah, no, I'm looking forward to next week, because now we're going to actually step in the ring and wrestle with Plato, and that's going to go a few rounds. Tag.
All right. Thanks.
See you guys. Have a great week.
Have a great week.